continue to get more analysis on this story now, South Africa being in a technical recession after 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. Let's get you more analysis now from Econometrics Director and Chief Economist Azar Jammine. Azar, what are we looking at in terms of the contributors, the biggest contributors to this negative growth in our economy?
Without a doubt, the biggest reason why we ended up with negative growth for a second consecutive quarter was the agricultural sector. And, that does give one a little bit of hope that in the second half of the year, we know agriculture has shown some kind of recovery, that the drought in the Western Cape has ended. We could see some positive figures coming in from that source in the second half of the year. But I think the drought in the Western Cape must have played a role in that. And it's also a case of, exactly when does one actually measure what has happened in agriculture. And that without that contraction in agriculture, there would have been some marginal positive growth overall. The other big surprise was transport and communication contracting by nearly 5% all of a sudden. This has been a sector that in the past has actually held up extremely well. And I'm not quite sure what has actually contributed to that, whether it's the transport side or the communication side, but that has had a very big and negative impact on the overall outcome.
Azar, what kind of effect does this have on the President's target of $100 billion of investment over the next 5 years? How does he go out and woo investors when our economy is in a technical recession?
You're absolutely right in raising that question, because clearly the perceptions of what's happening in South Africa are going to be that much more negative now as a consequence of these data. Ratings agencies will look askance at these data and say that this will make it even more difficult for the government to collect the taxes that it needs to get the revenue to bring down the public debt. And so quite clearly, Ramaphosa is going to have to really just kind of be mind-blowing in his persuasive abilities to try and get anyone to invest in this country at the moment.
And it's a vicious cycle, isn't it? How do we get people to invest in our country when we're in a technical recession? How do we improve those job numbers with well over half of our youth unemployed?
Unfortunately, it's a long-term process. And if someone could see that there was determination in amending some of the structural weaknesses of the economy, first and foremost, the appalling educational outcomes, I think that you could see a change in attitude towards South Africa, but there is no real sign of commitment to that. Instead, what we are seeing is little short-term palliatives being attempted, such as freezing fuel prices when they ought to be rising, and when they could rise by R1.50 a litre at this rate next month, instead of actually concentrating on improving the structures of the economy. But then one accepts that in an election year, the government places priorities elsewhere rather than the economy.
So, Azar, as this news comes in from Statistics South Africa, what are the biggest minds in government's economic cluster doing now? What are they discussing now? What should they be discussing?
I would love to know what they're discussing, because it should have been abundantly clear over a long period of time what the main weaknesses of the economy are. And in fact, none other than President Ramaphosa himself headed up the National Planning Commission that drew up the National Development Plan. But we are not seeing any of those or many of those ideas that were contained in the National Development Plan, especially with regard to the improvement in the human capital of the country being implemented.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks as always for weighing in on the discussion. Econometrics Director and Chief Economist Azar Jammine joining us on the line there. It is our breaking news story of the past hour. South Africa's economy is now in a technical recession. That's after 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth.